What's going on, everyone? So it has been a crazy week for Star Wars Unlimited. Lots of tournaments, lots of really solid players playing some Star Wars Unlimited, and we got ourselves kind of a little bit of a shakeup in the meta. Now there are still some clear favorites by far, but that's what we're here to talk about today. First off, I want to mention I have a TCG link in the description down below. Be sure to use it for any of your Star Wars Unlimited card needs. Second thing is I have a Patreon, and a lot of you have actually started to join in. And well, we're going to be starting to do some viewer games coming this weekend and some other things as well. So if you want to check out the Patreon down below, be sure to do so. Let's talk about the meta, Gen Con, some tournaments, and all the above. So what I've done here, what you're seeing here, is a complete list of all of the top 8s of the 3 days of Gen Con that we saw over the weekend. So we have a total of 24 lists broken up between the 3 days of top 8s. Now, there were a lot of extremely powerful decks, and there were a lot of really fun games, but there are some really clear favorites when you're looking up on the screen here. In terms of winners of the 3 days, well, day 1, we got ourselves a Han double yellow. So the Han double yellow in the top right corner here was the winner of day 1. Day 2 here, we saw Akira ECL. Now you'll notice I broke up Kira into ×1 and ×1. That's because we had one ECL green Kira and one regular Kira green without ECL. And then we had a day 3, and that was a Boba Yellow that took the number 1 spot. So we had a Boba Yellow, a Kira Green ECL. That was piloted by, I believe his name is Woo on YouTube. You might have seen some of his videos. Pretty popular creator for Star Wars Unlimited. And the other one was a Han Yellow list. Some of the players ended up playing multiple days and actually did end up top 8ing in multiple places. So some of these lists, like I believe the Han Yellow list, actually they had 2 top 8 spots over the 3 days, but was actually from the same player. But we'll get into all that as we get in. We're going to start off from the top left and move our way down. And honestly, I would start from Boba Fett, but I think it's more applicable to actually start with Sabine, because she actually has 7 top 8 finishes of the 3 days between Sabine Yellow and Sabine Green with ECL. Now, yes, these are 2 very different styles of decks, but there is saying something about aggro and something about Sabine in particular with aggro. If you look here across the whole board, there isn't really an aggro list that stands out. There are more tempo-oriented lists that do position themselves as aggro. For example, Han Yellow is more of a tempo list. Boba Yellow is more of a tempo list. These lists leverage the fact that they can get extra resources or get more resources and outpace your opponents, and then put pressure on and end the game by preventing you from doing a lot of stuff. Sabine is more traditional. Both Sabine Green and Sabine Yellow are trying to curve out early on in the game. In Sabine Yellow's case, it's more space units, really flooding the board. In Sabine Green's case, it's just high value units, and you kind of curve into wreckers and pose that you can ECL out for great effectiveness, whereas Sabine generally does not play pose and wreckers and usually focuses on the earlier curve. Regardless of which direction you're going, the fact that you get to run Sabine as your leader is huge. I talked about this in a previous video, but the fact that you guarantee 1 damage per turn to your opponent's base is insane. A couple of you mentioned, well, isn't that also doing a damage to your base? Yes. And if you're in the Sabine mirror, then that will be relevant. But usually Sabine is the fastest deck of the competitive format. It's up there with Boba Yellow, and will oftentimes end the games quicker than, well, Boba Yellow if you have a nice curve out. And so the fact that you're dealing 1 damage to each base isn't exactly relevant for you. Now, there are games where it is relevant, like if you are fighting Boba Yellow or Han Yellow, which are a little bit more aggressive, then yes, the dealing 1 damage to your base can be relevant. But for the most part, it just says deal 1 damage to your opponent's base, because the fact that you're dealing a damage to your base doesn't really matter since you're the aggro deck. You're the one that's trying to defeat your opponent before they can actually kind of recover from your early deployment of Sabine. So this allows you to prevent or potentially have your opponent start at like 25 HP instead of 30 HP on their base, or 20 HP instead of 25 HP. It's one of the reasons why a lot of people aren't even running ECL these days, because, well, in some cases, the HP that you're saving from ECL isn't actually worth that 5 damage loss or 5 damage prevention that you could have with a 30 HP base. Now, with Sabine ECL in particular, you can see that it's slightly edged out over Sabine Yellow. And I think the main reason for that is when you're in certain matchups, the fact that you can ECL out a Poe or a Wrecker really puts you over the edge, because defeating random upgrades like an Entrenched or a Traitorous can be extremely relevant, but also it gives you a lot of late game potential. Whereas when you're playing Sabine Yellow, you don't have those really explosive moments. Take, for example, some of the top 8 lists here, like Krennic Green or Han Yellow or Boba Green. They play some units that, when you get to the Wrecker turn, allows you to kill that unit and get in for damage. Take Boba Fett, for example. They deploy Boba Fett. Guess what? You ECL at a Wrecker, and suddenly you're hitting their base for 5. You get a 7-2 left behind, and you've killed their Boba Fett with an ECL Wrecker. Let's say they're playing Han Solo. If they deploy Han, then, well, you can ECL kill Han, or you can ECL kill Han unit, which is very frequently played in these decks, which doesn't leave Wrecker behind, but kills their unit and gets in for a total of 6 damage. All these things are really applicable and help you kind of finish out the game. In Sabine Yellow's case, it's really just all a matter of swarming your opponent. Cartel turncoats are really solid. Millennium Falcon, one of the best space units in the game, allows you to get in instant ready to damage. And most often, you're just focusing in on space units and really flooding with things like A-Wings, Cartel turncoats, Millennium Falcons. Heck, even in the later games, big Millennium Falcon that costs 6 resources is excellent as well. This deck performed amazingly. Or rather, Sabine in general just performed amazingly. Sabine Yellow is a little bit weaker, at least in terms of results, and I think the overall application of the deck against the meta right now. But Sabine Yellow, very solid alternative. The fact that it took top 8 spots across the board is really impressive, despite the fact that we had really solid players there. There is a consideration that some of the solid players would be like Rebel Resource, another YouTuber, was playing Sabine Yellow during this time. That might have pushed it up a little bit because we had like really well-known / solid players playing these lists. But overall, I found that Sabine Yellow is a solid list, and alongside Sabine Green takes potentially some of the top spots. At least from my perspective, Sabine Green is the deck to beat in the format alongside, well, Boba Yellow, which is the second deck that we got to talk about. Now, I spent a lot of time talking about Sabine. That's because she took 7 top 8 spots out of the 3 days, which is really impressive. Boba Yellow still keep it up, right? We've already saw Boba Yellow absolutely dominate the format in the previous couple of weeks, and he's still here as one of the most powerful decks in the format, if not like top 3 in the format right now. And that's mainly because of the fact of all the resources you get to ready. It's really solid against the tempo-oriented decks because you oftentimes just are able to tempo better. So if you're fighting Han Yellows, if you're fighting Sabine Greens or Sabine Yellows, most often than not, when you get that Boba Fett down, you start to really just outpace. Things like Cunnings can prevent your opponents from getting out damage a ton. You can go ahead and just return units, leverage more resources, and deploy to the board. You have things that can potentially just trade in with your opponent's units early on with things like Crafty Smuggler, Surprise Strike. You have so many access avenues of attack with Boba Yellow that it just really is hard to keep up with. The fact that you could leverage additional resources with this deck, and as we've seen with Boba in general, on top of the fact that you get to get in damage and deploy to the board while you're tempoing out your opponent, is extremely powerful. One of the things that, Han has in terms of, getting down higher cost units kind of gets negated in some cases with the fact that Boba gets to bounce it to potentially to your hand and then deploy things afterwards. You get to put on pressure and go ahead and remove your opponent's threats while just completely having the most broken leader in the entire game right now. It is really impressive. But what's funny about this is Boba also has a different variant in one of the top 8 spots here in Boba Green. Now, Boba Green was the preferred version in set 1. I think towards the end of set 1, we saw Boba Yellow creep up as the more popular version of Boba in general. And we found that Boba Yellow most of the time is going to perform a little bit better than Boba Green, simply because Cunning itself is such a ridiculous card. There's a reason why we have 2 double yellow lists that are towards the top end of the meta, and that is because of Cunning, for the most part. Yes, the overall decks shape up extremely well, but when you have a card such powerful, so much power in Cunning, it really, really changes the aspect of the game, or it changes the layout of the game. Now, Han has also a very powerful combo alongside Cunning, but There are some really disgusting turns that you can have with Boba and with Han, with Cunning, that you just can't have with like Boba Green or, you know, some of the other decks in the format. And that's why Boba Green isn't nearly as popular, despite getting some really powerful tools such as Maul. Boba Green was previously a little bit more of a mid-range, kind of ramping into some really powerful turns and leveraging additional resources, right? Steadfast Battalion on the Boba Fett flip turn was one of the most powerful things you could do. But now with Boba Green, you have better ramp, you have more options, such as Maul to kind of close out the game on that Maul turn, because he comes in, ambushes, and just immediately kills something, probably lives because you have underworld units in the deck, and hits your opponent's base, while also playing the similar things as you have earlier, which is super laser technicians. You still got potentially your crafty smugglers, you still have your Boba Fett's, etc., etc., etc. You also get access to one of the most powerful events in the game, which is Overwhelming Barrage. But that could actually be a downside. One of the things with some of these decks, such as Sabine, doesn't actually play a lot of non-unit cards, and that's actually a really nice advantage because, as I mentioned earlier, double yellow decks are very prevalent in the meta, and one of the most powerful cards in Han Solo's case on turn 1 and in Boba Fett's case on turn 2 is Bodhi, and that can absolutely wreck your hand if you're relying on those non-unit cards. It's one of the reasons why I try to steer towards not running as many non-units in my more tempo / aggro decks, because they kind of get free value. Of course, in some cases, it's just good to run those cards, but it's something that you have to consider. And Overwhelming Barrage is one of those cards where if you're relying on this card to kind of wipe up the board, deal with some space units or whatever, you kind of are gonna be a little bit on thin ice, because there are a lot of situations where they can just rip it from your hand. But overall, Boba Green still performing quite well. One of the better decks in the formats. I would put it like tier 2, or maybe tier 1.5. Boba Yellow, definitely the tier 1 version of Boba. Whereas I think Sabine Yellow and Sabine Green, I think they're both in the conversation for tier 1, but just something a little bit interesting to acknowledge. On to the next one that we got to talk about is Krennic Green. Now, Krennic is a deck that I spoke a lot about in my tier list because I have found that Krennic Green is just extremely powerful. Opposed to the more hard control lists like Vader Blue, for example, I've been really impressed with these soft control lists such as Krennic Green, and we're going to talk about another one a little bit later on, that really are able to leverage, well, the control elements that you get to run while also putting on pressure with your opponent. We saw, well, in one of the matchups, this top 8 matchup, like Krennic Green versus Hondo Blue, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, there was like a total of 4 super laser blasts actually used in the game, and they were just grinding out the game absolutely amazingly throughout the entire span of the 3 matches. Now, this was definitely a situation where restock and things like that was actually not necessarily the way you're going to be winning these games. If you go back to set 1, one of the things with these hard control matches was the restock / Spark Rebellion / bounty hunter crew combination that we were running. Why? Because the way you would win these games, generally in control matchups, or when you're playing control, was using Avengers and using Child Sins to potentially beat down your opponent. And that was really the only ways you had to win the game. You in some cases had like Emperor Palpatines or maybe your leader flip, but that's really how you won, was Avenger. And without that, because your control opponent could deal with that, well, you had to rely on restock and vigilance to mill out your opponent, and then Spark Rebellion to take your opponent's restocks or vigilances and whatnot. But now, even in the kind of soft control mirror, it's all about unit damage, generally speaking. Of course, sometimes it goes to time, but it's really about things that you can get from your resource pile with the new smuggle mechanic, or just getting down a bunch of good units. And restock doesn't usually come into play, which is a little bit of a different shift. And that's because that we're playing more soft control. And what do I mean by soft control versus hard control? Hard control relies on very few win conditions and just purely trying to control the board, whereas soft control actually is able to potentially put on some pressure if you have a little bit of a slower draw, or potentially just controlling into bigger value units that allow you to wipe up the board and continue onwards to end the game. We have additional answers or additional units such as Snoke that do a really nice job of this, alongside the Avengers, which people are still playing, and then a bunch of random other units that, depending on the deck, people are playing. Krennic Green in particular, the ability to come down on 5, restore 2, get some nice value going is really, really good against some of the aggro / tempo lists. that restore 2 can really save you. And remember, if you attack something and maybe are able to kill it with Krennic, it becomes a 3 powered unit, which is a lot more relevant. And because of this ability to give your damaged units +1 power, you actually are able to really leverage that into some really valuable situations. Overall, Krennic has been pretty powerful as of late, and I've been pretty impressed with Krennic and how he's been doing in the meta. And it's something that I mentioned to keep a lookout for when I was going over the tier list. But then we get to probably the most exciting deck for a lot of people, and that is Hondo Yellow, mainly because of the Tech DJ combo. Now, I will mention the strength of Han does not rely purely on this combo. This is a combo that's good against things like Krennic, or things like maybe a Boba Green, where it's relying on this flip from Boba Yellow or Boba Green on a specific turn, and you get to steal a resource for them, preventing that and playing into your tempo game, which is really powerful. And remember, the reason why Han Green is the deck, or Han Yellow here, or Han Green, are the decks that are playing it is because of Han's action. The ability to get this combo down early, for example, you go turn 1, play a 3-drop, turn 2, play your tech, turn 4, or turn 3, go ahead and get down your DJ from your smuggle pile, is really powerful. That's way better than so many other decks. Heck, if you're playing Han Green, you could even go resupply on turn 1. Turn 2, go ahead and play your tech. Turn 3, you just play your DJ, which is really quite powerful, right? There's a lot of different situations that you can do with Han Double Yellow and Han Green. But the aspect of Han Yellow that's truly scary is the fact that you get to leverage additional resources in the early game for higher value units and just play this massively disruptive game. Turn 1, Bodhi, take your non-unit. Turn 2, play Akira. Turn 3, do some other shenanigans. You know, you still get to play your Han Solo 7's turn where you flip Han, play a Han unit, and suddenly you have board control and your opponent doesn't have anything on the battlefield and you're putting on pressure. And that's where Han Yellow gets really scary, is I get to disrupt your hand, I get to disrupt your units that you're playing, and I get to put on pressure while doing so. And it's the same thing that Boba Yellow is able to do, right? Put on pressure while also disrupting your opponents, and then put on more pressure because of leveraging additional resources by readying them. In Han's case, you get more value because you get to play, or you get higher value units. In Boba's case, you get more options and more plays in a single turn. But Han, you get to sacrifice cards in your hand, and Boba, you can't necessarily play higher costed units because of the fact that you don't actually get additional resources. You just get to ready the ones if you already spent. So a little bit of a different play style, but definitely extremely strong. And as I mentioned, that Tech DJ combo that we talked about is really powerful against some of the decks in the format. For example, Palp Yellow, which takes so long to get to the leader, that's really good against. Something like a Krennic Green or a Hondo Blue, very good against. Kira Green, also very good against. That Tech DJ combo can really do some work. Boba Green. But then when you consider Sabine Yellow, Sabine Green, Boba Yellow, this is where the kind of Tech DJ combo really falls in kind of options or favor in these matchups, because you really don't want to be spending all these resources and all this time to play 3/5s and 2/5s in your aggressive matchup to try to steal a resource, which they probably don't even necessarily need. In Sabine Green's case, it's a little bit more important, and maybe Boba Yellow's case, a little bit more important than Sabine Yellow. And in some games, it will be relevant to kind of put your opponent off, like the Boba flip turn, potentially, if you're able to do that. But for the most part, you're looking at playing a more tempo-oriented game and leveraging just the fact that you could play more valuable units and then you get to play cutting in your list. It's a really powerful list, and I think is edging over Han Green, like old Han Green, which was what people were preferring in the earlier stages of the meta. But now we're starting to see a lot of Han Double Yellow, which is really cool to see. The next one that we got to talk about is Kira Green and Kira ECL. Again, I have a ×1 here because one of them was playing Kira ECL, and that was the one that ended up taking down day 2 of Gen Con. And the other one was playing just normal Kira Green. Now, this list was really cool. Honestly, it parallels Director Krennic a lot, and then other lists that we're going to talk about a little bit later on in Hondo Blue. But for the most part, the fact that you get to leverage kind of Kira as this removal on her flip turn is really powerful. Unlike Krennic, where Krennic used sort of as a little bit more value, restoring, get some HP in, get some trades in potentially. Kira is used almost like not like an overwhelming barrage necessarily, but a way to deal a lot of damage to your opponent's units, allowing your maybe less valuable units to trade, or setting up for an overwhelming barrage, or setting up just to trade with your opponent's leader just straight up with Kira herself, which is really, really nice. On top of that, you just get some value with some shield tokens, and overall, you're playing this soft control list that mirrors Krennic and Hondo Blue. There isn't really anything too crazy to mention here outside of the fact that you are playing Kira herself, but this list is really in line with the soft controls of the format that we've been kind of used to. It's just a matter of playing a little bit of a different leader. The next one, on the other hand, is really, really cool, and that is New Hondo Blue. Now, alongside Kira, these are set 2 leaders, and Hondo. Everything else is a set 1 leader. We talked a lot about Boba, we talked a lot about Sabine, we talked a lot about Krennic, and even Old Han. They are definitely more favorable in general for the meta, and they are set 1 leaders. In terms of set 2, Kira and New Han seem to be performing pretty well, and New Han in particular has had Han Double Red, Han Green, approached near the top 8, and now Han Blue, has already been in the top 8, but Han Blue has started to show up quite a bit. Now, I've tried a lot of versions of Han, and these 3 are all very, very powerful. It looks like Han Blue, depending on where the meta shakes up, could be even stronger than the other 2, again, depending on the matchup. But the powerful nature of this is being able to play some of your 7 drops a turn earlier is really, really strong, especially when some of those 7 drops are Luke Skywalker, right? Playing a 6/5 Luke Skywalker with Restore 3 and kill a unit is really quite insane on turn 5. Mind you, you still get to play all your standard stuff, right? If you want to play things like A-Wing, you can still play it in the deck. If you want to play things like your Obi-Wan, you can get down that a turn earlier. If you go Obi-Wan into Luke, that's a really insane curve. You could still play your Worshir Tree Tenders and your Grit units that pump up even more. But the power of this deck really relies on just being able to play such valuable units so early on. A really, really nice curve for this deck is to go something along the lines of like turn 1 Yoda, turn 2 K2, turn 3 play a Rey or a Poe Dameron, turn 4 play a Obi-Wan, turn 5 play a Luke Skywalker, okay, turn 6 play a Chewbacca, turn 7 you're playing Krayt Dragons, right? That is a really difficult curve to deal with, right? If you're just playing the best unit on every single point of the curve, it is really tough to deal with. And this is another list that something like Rey, where she comes down on 4 resources essentially as a 4/5, is actually able to not die and be able to heal up some of the damage that you've dealt to some of your earlier units. But there are just so many powerful threats in this deck that it makes it really tough to deal with, while also being able to play something like Pillage, because you're playing that more mid-rangey style that actually just completely wrecks decks like, well, Han Yellow in certain circumstances, or even the ramp decks. If your Han Yellow opponent is trying to set up for like the Han Solo 7 turn, playing a Pillage could absolutely destroy them because they usually have only 2 cards at that point in the game in their hand, and you could completely ruin their whole tempo orient plan, which is really nice. So Han Blue definitely rising in my priority list and one of my recently favorite decks to play, just because of how many good units that you can play. Again, there are different versions of it, but the list that I personally have found to be the best is just to play all your best units on curve all the way through. Obi-Wans, Lukes, Chewbacca's, Krayt Dragons, and we kind of already knew this because that's what we were doing with every version of Han. I have played the aggro version, which is good, but just playing high value units 1 cheaper the whole game, well, that's just really good. Who knew? The other decks that we got to talk about, Palpatine Yellow and Hondo Blue. Now, Palpatine Yellow, this is a deck that I've had a lot of fun with over the course of set 1. It's a deck that's kind of dropped in favor as of set 2 because we now have Palpatine Double Green, which I think is the overall better performing / better version of Palpatine. But Palpatine Yellow does something a little bit different, which is leverage a little bit of the underworld synergies and some of the early game removal. And I mean things like Cloud Riders, for example, while also playing things like Forlom and Zuckuss. The combination of those 2 is really powerful. And you even get the Change of Heart Steal, Kill, Sack combo. This is something that's very commonly played in Magic in some of the more limited formats, which is steal your unit, sack it, get some damage in, and get some value. And with Palpatine, with Change of Heart, what you could do is steal one of their very powerful units, attack their other unit, kill it, and then if it's still alive, you get to sack it with the action or defeat it, and then get to draw a card, which is really, really strong. So all of that to say, there's a lot of synergy with the Palp Yellow deck, and it overall does some really, really nice work against the meta. However, I found that Palpatine Green has had a little bit better of a showing overall, and yet this Palpatine Yellow list is really cool to show up here at the end of the top 8. Lastly, and this is the list I want to hone in on here at the end of the video, the Hondo Blue. This is a list out of all the lists here. All of these were on my radar. Like, all of them were decks that I've played, all of the decks that I could see potentially taking a top 8 spot. They were all kind of like B tier or above in what I would consider decks that have a shot at getting a top 8. Maybe they're not going to get a future top 8. Like, I wouldn't have expected Palpatine Yellow to have like an amazing shot, but it definitely could have gotten into the top 8. But everything else, like Krennic Green, Han Yellow, Sabine Green, Sabine Yellow, Boba Green, Kira Green, Han Blue, like all these lists are not surprised to see in the top 8. Hondo, on the other hand, this came out of left field, and I did not have this on my radar at all. The experience I've had with Hondo is with Hondo Green, Hondo Wren, Hondo Yellow, but I have not played a Hondo Blue list. And the main reason for that is the cards that I saw on this list, I just deemed as unplayable. And I tried to play some of the like smuggled cards, and I just did not create the proper list, or, maybe this person just cracked the code, because I've played this list and it's actually really powerful and it's done some pretty nice work. So I'm going to pop over and actually showcase this list here for you all, because this to me is the most shocking list of the entire day or entire weekend. So here you got it. This is the Hondo Blue list that we saw in the top 8, and we actually saw it on camera that I was able to see over the weekend, which was really, really cool. And you can see it's a soft control list. And what I mean by soft control, again, is it has early plays. It's not purely reliant on events and removal and all this stuff to get some value. Instead, it's playing this more like mid-rangey soft control game where you have a lot of removal and you're just playing really good units along the curve in some cases, or in other cases, you're just playing removal, and then playing your really good units from the smuggle pile later on in the game. Now, what do you even get from Hondo? Well, anytime you play a card using smuggle, you can exhaust leader to go ahead and give that experience token, an experience token to a unit. He flips for 6 as a 3/7 with raid 1 and has that same ability, but instead of having to exhaust Hondo, you could just, get that experience token. And what are the smuggle cards that we're really seeing in this deck? Well, there are 2 that I said earlier that I thought were just completely unplayable, and that is Collection Starhopper and Vigilance Pursuit Craft. These cards, if you have not seen them, 2 resource 2/2 space unit, not like trash, but like pretty mediocre to bad, and then it has a smuggle for 3. Like, that just seems completely not going to happen at any point in the game, and yet we saw it happen a ton here on camera, which is pretty crazy, right? The other one is Vigilant Pursuit Craft. It's a 5 resource 3/5 vigilance, or 3/5 sentinel in space. Another card that I didn't think was like uber trash, but just not good enough to the point where it's not really playable in competitive formats. But this smuggles for 7, and that's what we saw. We saw a smuggle out for 7. Now, the nice thing about Hondo is that it makes these smuggle options a lot more reasonable, right? Like, if you're smuggling out Collection Starhopper for 3, you get a 3/3, which is much better than a 2 resource 2/2, right? So that's okay. And that's where Hondo comes into play, and it makes some of these things playable. Outside of these cards, well, you're kind of just playing this, again, slow-paced, high-value, control/value deck to beat out your opponent. And what we saw is in the matches where you're playing the more aggressive decks, well, you have things like Make an Opening and Power of the Dark Side and Vigilance to deal with their aggressive start, and then outvalue them with things like the Client, putting bounties on everything, Child Sin getting massive, and then finishing them off with the Overwhelming Barrage. Or finishing them off later on in the game by smuggling out things like Long Pike, Collection Starhopper, or Vigilant Pursuit Craft, Covert Strength, Time Interventions, and getting high value from your units. And of course, in the late stage of the game, you have things like Maul and Snoke. In the control mirror, what we are seeing is this massively long game where people were like super laser blasting, people are playing units one after another, someone would play an Avenger or a Devastator, someone would power the dark side it, whatever it was. You weren't really seeing Vigilance mill kills. What you were seeing was Hondo go to his turn, play a unit, play a couple units maybe, go into a smuggle pile, play another unit, and it was just unit after unit after unit because you're resourcing all these earlier units that you don't really care about, and then you're pulling them out of your resource pile later on to where you have so many threats at any given point, and eventually the opponent's control doesn't really match up against your pressure. And I will say on camera, I saw a mistake by the Hondo Blue player. They were trying to like go extremely fast on camera, so I don't blame them. And your opponent, or their opponent, ended up playing a Sentinel in space. I believe it was a Devastator, and they tried to attack their base. They essentially said, I attack your base, and well, it was not a valid target, so they had to hit the space unit. Now, in that situation, if I was in that spot, I would have called over a judge and been like, okay, hey, how do we, situate this self out? Because I said I attack your base. That's not a legal target. Will I have been able to, go back and, change what a play I made, or would I have had to have attacked into their Sentinel? That's the question I would have asked. I'm not sure what they would have ruled. It's possible that because he said I attack your base, that's declaring an attack, and you would have had to. But depending on the judge, that could be rearranged. And if they ended up kind of playing their cards in the correct order, which is playing Power of the Dark Side, which they had in hand before they attacked, they actually would have had enough damage to finish out the game and actually take the win. So we could have seen like Hondo Blue potentially, absolutely crushing it here and having even a better score than we saw already with Hondo Blue, which is kind of crazy to consider. But outside of that, I mean, it was really awesome to see this deck on camera, really awesome to see Lom Pike do some work, and it really was able to be put to the test and do some major work. Not that I think Hondo Blue is going to be a top deck of the meta or anything. I think that just the player that was playing it actually just did a really nice job and had intimate knowledge of their deck, because it's not a deck that a lot of people were fighting against and maybe were not prepared for. And so that's an advantage in Hondo Blue's case. And because of all that, I would definitely still put this in like tier 2, like a B tier for sure. But before, I wouldn't even had it on the list. Like it would have been a C, like bottom of C tier type situation for me if I were to rate Hondo Blue. And I don't even think Hondo in general is a very good leader, but this is a way where you can leverage the slow pace smuggle options because of the control aspects, which is a really awesome combination. So I figured I would show this list to you all here, just because it was the list that impressed me the most and had me kind of like, oh wow, I gotta stick around for this game because that is sweet to watch. But that's going to wrap up kind of our meta discussion for today. Let me know what you all think about the top 8 slots and everyone that made it. And if you were there, let me know how it went for you. And I know Rebel Resource comes in and comments on the videos. It was awesome to see, his list perform admirably at the or on the tournament. So props to him and props to his finish. I'm not actually sure where he finished, but I believe I saw he was into the top 16 at the minimum. So that was awesome for him. Very, very solid stuff. And, well, I'm happy to have watched and happy to have been part of the community for this stuff. So let me know what you all think. Is there a deck that maybe someone's sleeping on, or you think that maybe one of these decks is not properly represented? Like maybe you think Boba Green's super strong, but didn't quite get there. Or maybe you think Palpatine Green should have taken one of these spots. We just didn't see enough lists, etc., etc., etc. Let me know in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching, everyone, and I'll see you all for the next one.